Welcome to Clothing Culture, a fashion industry podcast at the intersection of technology and innovation. I'm Emily Lane.
And I'm Bret Schitnker. We speak with experts and disruptors who are moving the industry forward
And discuss solutions to real industry challenges.
Clothing Culture is brought to you by Stars Design Group, a global design and production house with more than 30 years of experience.
Welcome back to another episode of Clothing Culture. Once again, we were back inside of the corporate office of Stars Design Group, and I'm joined by Bret Schitnker, CEO.
Hi, Em.
Welcome to another exciting conversation. Today, we are going to be talking about looking south for nearshoring opportunities. This is something that comes up nearly daily, if not every day. And we're going to talk about the pros and cons and opportunities that exist. I think it might be start to kind of have a quick look at maybe the more traditional viewpoint, which has been looking east, to get a little foundation about where this shift is happening, where the opportunities can exist, and so forth.
Yeah, most brands, manufacturers, and apparel have always traditionally looked east, and there's a reason for it. You know, Asia represents about 73% of all production in garments in the world today. And so, you know, we're used to going to, and when you're looking at Asia, it's a big block. It's, you know, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, Cambodia, Thailand, to a lesser degree. All of these, and certainly Vietnam, these groups, these major groups in the Far East and then Near East and India, places like that, represent a pretty large conglomerate, along with Bangladesh, producing a lot of apparel. And so, you know, the shift is, there is this attractiveness to manufacturing close because of some of the increasing challenges that are occurring there, but I'm not quite sure that there's full solutions to that looking south. There's people need to be aware that there are some challenges to looking south, part of a portfolio.
Absolutely. You know, I would see one of those challenges as being, you know, there's vast infrastructure in place.
Yes.
Where this manufacturing has been happening for many, many years now and continually invested in. So, you know, really gearing up that kind of infrastructure in other regions, it takes time, not only from an infrastructure standpoint, but from a skill set standpoint as well.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there are rising costs going on in the East, but at the same time, along with those rising costs, they're increasing productivity with technology. So they're able to offset those things. They really have built a very strong machine for production, and the infrastructure is there. Everything from mills and trims and dyeing houses and, you know, the entire, and it's a robust infrastructure to manage production.
Where do you think the bulk of the concern is for moving things closer? Obviously, there's some of the obvious things which everybody knows about, you know, logistics and so forth. But there is a demand saying, you know, we want to move away from Asia. What is going on to foster that desire?
Yeah, I would say in some parts of the market, it's emotion. You know, there's a little bit of a tension between China and the U.S. that hasn't occurred in some time. And so some of that's emotional. Some of it's probably maybe misplaced patriotism, in my opinion. You know, hey, China's bad, we're good. I don't think that's necessarily true because they're a strong manufacturing partner for us, and we help them get there, frankly. But some of the other challenges that are going on are more tangible. We're seeing an issue with Xinjiang that's coming up right now. Xinjiang is a region in China where 80% of the cotton production is coming from in China. And there's an ongoing dialogue about this challenge with the Uyghur community there and some of the human rights issues that continually creep up. And I don't think China has successfully quelled the concerns that the international community has. Sometimes, and it almost appears like they're not even concerned about quelling those concerns. And so, you know, difficult conditions exist around the world. We're seeing that in Ukraine. We're seeing that all over the place. But I think there's some international responsibility. We're trying to make life better for people. And so there's going to be some increased scrutiny on cotton coming out of Xinjiang. I think that's going to create some additional issues for manufacturing in China, just from a business level. That, the certifications that are required, you almost take a lot of cotton out of the market if you cannot have Xinjiang cotton. So people from a business level are certainly looking at that aspect, most definitely. We're still dealing with the duty plus tariff issue. So with rising costs, we're looking at still very expensive freight. And for the first time in a long time in history, the last couple of years, where you had like 11 to 18 days boat, and you had a couple days, a week on either side for clearance and export, have now become 75 to 90 days. And so it's a combination of things that continue. But I'm not quite sure that it is enough for us to, and we don't have a place to go, frankly. That's one of the other things. If you look in the Americas for production, the West, if you will, and that's Central America, South America in general, they represent only about 17% of all production. So there's a long way to go for them to be able to manage more business.
Yeah, I can imagine it's a mathematical
that's
equation.
Coming out of
really.
Asia.
If you take globally the production that's happening in Asia and try to move that to a new zone, Central America or South America, now all of a sudden that demand is going to quickly outweigh what can realistically happen from a production standpoint.
That actually happened within Asia this year. A lot of people moved out of China, moved to the neighboring Vietnam, and Vietnam demand exceeded supply, and there were a ton of delivery delays within Vietnam.
Right, yeah. And I also imagine when a certain region gets so much volume, they really get to pick and choose what they want, and so it's like, well, let's do the thing that's the quickest and easiest to turn so we can keep our lines moving and things of that nature. Do you see that, or is that just an assumption?
Look, that's just economics 101. When demand exceeds supply, a couple things happen. One, the suppliers become a lot more selective. They're able to streamline customers along with the best way that the factories will work most efficiently, but also costs go up because, especially in our business, we haven't seen a ton of profit taking occurring for a number of years. Even now in our business, the profit taking is happening with the shipping lines. It's not really happening wholesale with the manufacturers. They're still, having to figure out ways to become competitive in a more increasing environment. But when you get into a situation where demand is exploding and the supply base is less, then certainly they're going to eke up prices, I would imagine.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that also.
So for us at Stars, we were invited 2.5 years ago on the cusp of COVID to participate in a project with the U.S. Department of Trade. And we went to El Salvador to help foster relationships, help consult on how they can bring manufacturing to the levels that we would require to export to the United States. And it's been a really interesting consulting project over the last 2.5 years. Having recently gone as kind of a conclusion of that project, it has been exciting to see the development that has happened over the last 2.5 years. I do see great transition, but obviously there's still some work to be done. Bret, I'd love for you to share some insights as to, especially with your expertise, on what we saw maybe 2.5 years ago, and maybe some of the development of where it's at now, and then after that, we can kind of talk a little bit more about its application with the demand that's happening now.
Yeah, I would say we see transition, but it's a microcosm. It's a small group of factories that were kind of selected to make that transition. El Salvador in general is, it makes up a part of Central America, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. And that group, each country within that group has experienced probably more success in manufacturing growth or industrial growth as it relates to manufacturing or less. And El Salvador sort of lagged behind for for a number of years. The previous government probably didn't feel like it was that important. They kind of wanted to leapfrog that and jump into technology. That's not how economies that I know of work. I think that you have to learn the steps of industrialization along the way. Every main country that we can kind of talk about in Asia, moved along that path. And that's the great thing about apparel, is that it's an easy place to begin that journey of industrialization. And I've seen it happen in a number of countries over my career and in the countries that I've worked with. And today, the current government's receptive. I think that the trade minister of economics and trade is a sharp person. She really understands the need to establish, more volume business. And I think she's very
embrace technology. She's very forward thinking.
I agree. I think in general, Maria Breve really knows that this is a pathway toward more hope for the country. And so that's a positive for sure. And so it's just the country today, almost 80 or 90% of the country is still made up of small machinas and small operating units that aren't efficient, that aren't really looking heavily for export. And the free trade zones kind of dominate the majority of what they recognize as export volume, which I think is over a third of their export volume is in apparel today. But there's a huge potential to grow that number. And so, being down there, I think the people are wonderful. I think that they've got the mindset for doing that. They just continue to need more, guidance and assistance to organize in the country. Organization, I think, is really critical. Today, it's not super organized. It's kind of organized within different cliques and groups, but not organized together in a common goal to grow that country's production efficiently.
And build the resources and their own kind of internal supply chain.
Yeah, they certainly have some resource for sure. We've seen some pretty dynamic resource. Some of that resource is dated and needs to be kind of, brought to the modern day, maybe offering more opportunity. But, to qualify for CAFTA, you've got to, which is duty free to the U.S. under that agreement, you've got to make sure that your products, for the most part, are all developed within the CAFTA region. So, they can certainly source some of that, from neighboring countries. But, there is some infrastructure, but I think El Salvador has a long way to go. There's some excitement for sure, but they've got a long way to go.
So, El Salvador isn't the only country that's a part of the CAFTA countries.
Right.
And, we've had some experience in other countries as well.
Yeah.
Guatemala, Honduras. Are there some challenges or advantages that you see to some of those neighboring countries?
I think some of those countries are certainly further along. They've, at one point, 92, 93, I was one of the largest exporters out of Guatemala, and our company at the time was one of the largest exporters out of Central America, I believe, in multiple categories. And the two strongest manufacturing countries we were focused on at the time in that region, because they throw Dominican Republic in there as part of this CAFTA agreement, but were Guatemala and Honduras. They kind of embraced large production. They used kind of international investment into the country, and that international investment was pretty aggressive in those countries. And those countries also catered to the international investment. Those two countries are what I would consider the most stable for the longest period of time in Central America. So that makes people comfortable with investing, because large factories are certainly long-term investments.
There are a lot of benefits to looking at this region. One of them that we've experienced a few times now is just the travel is so much easier. We can get there in a few hours, and easily come back home. And
Yep.
so looking at a trip to Central America versus going east, it's quite a time and cost savings. So I can
Sure.
see some of those benefits. Are there other benefits that you think people should consider as they're exploring this region?
Yeah, certainly. The U.S. Trade Department has allowed for duty-free imports as long as, a large majority of the product is built in those countries, and that can be a definite benefit. Sometimes the rising costs that are occurring in Central America times the productivity levels that are occurring, diffuse that benefit a little bit, but there is certainly a benefit to that. For some of the key operations down there, if companies are strategic about how they build and develop plans there, production can be done rather quickly, more on basics, of course. But, you can build 35, 45-day turns out of Central America on production, stocking gray, stocking dyed, and I'm talking more T-shirts, sweatshirts, more basic items. But that's great. A lot of people love to be able to react to business, and that's becoming more and more challenging in Asia, both near and far. So that's a benefit. The other thing, too, certainly is the transit times. So we've talked ad nauseum about all the issues that are going on today, and I don't think in freight they're not going to go away anytime soon. And so when you're looking at really 75 to 90 days, including clearance out of Asia at the best, your ability to ship and clear in 9 to 10 days out of Central America seems drastically better, of course.
Of course, especially
Behind
for
the
those
scenes,
who are more excited about chasing demand.
well, I think in general, if you buy closer to business, maybe you make better decisions, hopefully. But I would say, in addition to that, the actual cost per container. So, costs are starting to, and I really put heavy quotation marks on this, stabilize in container costs. They had skyrocketed to $22,000, $24,000 a container when things got really nuts. Maybe we're $8,000 or $10,000 a container now on a 40-foot. And they might come down, but they're certainly nowhere close to where they were a couple years ago. But out of Central America, your container costs are $3,000 to $4,000. So when you're amortizing shipments there, that cost is certainly better also. I think the desire to do business in the countries exists.
Yeah.
Also, I think our business is made of people, and there's a desire and an aggressiveness from the people that we've met they really want to change their lives. They want to improve their lives.
Help,
Sure.
After building relationships over the last couple of years, it's certainly something we've fallen in love with a lot of people there and want to see their lives improve.
Yeah, everywhere I've gone, good business solves a lot of issues if you can scale.
Yeah. What are some of the key challenges that you see still remaining in this region?
People want to transplant some of the things that they can do in Asia and Central America, and that's where the challenge lies, and especially where demand far exceeds supply. So everyone is looking south now. Everyone wants to go south because they're like, for all the reasons we've mentioned. The challenges you have are that business in the south has been built on commodity basics for a lot of years. And it makes sense. It's easiest to go through lines. You're maximizing your profit on each line. And so it's going to be challenging. Some of the conversations that we've had where they want to implement some challenging, difficult garments into a factory that's doing basics, and they want to have a ton of flexibility in terms of orders. Look, when demand far exceeds supply, factories aren't going to be super keen to do that. They're going to be focusing on the most efficient production possible that's going through there. There's also some limitations on the type of products that you can produce in the region and qualify for duty-free. So those are things to be aware of, too.
Yeah. Well, you always say evolution, not revolution.
Right.
So absolutely, there are some opportunities brewing that will help support a lot of nearshoring goals, but we always recommend moving slowly and thoughtfully, have a plan in place, And, you don't have to just make a sudden move tomorrow.
Yeah, it's part of a portfolio.
Exactly.
When you diversify your stocks, you diversify your production similarly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing this conversation with me today, Bret. And if anyone out there needs a little help navigating this complex world of manufacturing, of course at Stars Design Group, we can certainly help. Thank you for participating in our conversation today. And don't forget to subscribe to stay apprised of upcoming episodes of Clothing Culture.